Going over Module 1, basically the readings and videos, basically touched on ex-slave struggles for universal schooling, um, why they pursued it, and how they organized to defend their common interest, how they coped with the resistance of opposing social classes, and how they gained the cooperation of sympathetic social groups. So basically, to give some background, um, slave owners during slavery feared literate slaves. Um, they're afraid of revolt, or they're afraid of slaves being able to influence other slaves to disobey or go against the wishes of slave owners, because they could read and write and basically educate themselves on different things that slave owners didn't want them to educate themselves on. Um, so basically, slaves had to come up with an alternative learning. Um, some were personally instructed by masters. Others were instructed by slaves that already learned how to read and write. Um, so basically, so post-slavery, or getting towards the end of slavery, um, a lot of slaves had a deep desire to read and write. A lot of them were led to believe that during slavery, and also kind of towards the end of slavery and after, that their ability to read and write would ultimately be their salvation, and basically give them the opportunity to live a life of true freedom and ability to make their own decisions and control their own fate. There's certain situations that I read about that many ex-slaves were manipulated, and were manipulated because they couldn't read and write. Right? You talk about voting, going to voting booths, and not being able to read ballots and make the vote that's the best for them. Instead, they had to make votes that favored politicians' wishes, basically. Um, and there's other situations to where they were manipulated. Another thing as well, um, many slaves during slavery self-educated. There were slaves that were literate in reading and writing, that already had formed schools with many students that attended and were able to learn how to read and write, and basically just learn basic skills that they needed to know in order to put themselves in a better position. They called these schools native schools. So these were schools that were founded and maintained by ex-slaves. There was reports that there were two slaves that were teaching 150 pupils at one time. So show you that there were very large groups that were attending these native schools. And also, too, like I said, slaves try to self-educate themselves on their own outside of the native schools as well. By 1866, at least 500 native schools were found throughout the South. A guy by name John W. Alford was assigned. Basically, his job was to go around the South and look at different schools, or look at how many native schools there were, and how many African Americans were trying to educate themselves, in order to go back and tell these political groups and social groups that, hey, these people are trying to educate themselves. We need to try our best to assist them and take action in helping these people, because they truly want to learn, and and create a culture of education. Also, too, throughout all these, all the struggles of this, ex-slaves committed money and labor to help make sure that these schools were possible, basically, and organized committees in order to supervise these schools that they had formed, these native schools. So it just goes to show you how committed and how invested these slaves were to be educated, right? They were willing to give up, the little to no money that they had to invest in these schools so their kid had the opportunity to learn and get an education. Um, Continuing on, so basically, one of the issues that ex-slaves and ex-slaves ran into were planners, and planners were people that own major plantations in the South, and they were opposed to African American education. Some of them would threaten to put black families um, out of their houses. So one of them was their landlord. They would threaten basically to kick them out if they knew, if they got any word of them trying to educate their children or themselves. Also, if you had a employer that didn't want you to educate yourself or to educate your kids, and they found out that you were doing so, that's another reason that they would terminate their employment and say, hey, you're done. You can't work here because you're trying to educate yourself and you're trying to educate your children. And basically, for me, that pretty much, showed me how important really education were to slaves, and the stigma when it comes to blacks and education is, oh, black people are dumb, or black people don't want to learn, or things of that nature. But it's clear as day here that they were willing to sacrifice so much and put themselves in danger, and just risk a lot of things, money, safety, even roof over their head, just so that they could read and write and pursue education. For me, that just shows that African Americans and blacks really do value education, and that stigma is untrue to the fullest.